It's time to go on the record with WRAL News.
Good evening and welcome to On the Record. I'm Dan Haggerty. So in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes. Fortunately, you only die once. Taxes, on the other hand, well, you're taxed before you're paid, when you're paid, and again, when you spend it. If you buy a car, you're taxed on that. Then you're taxed just to own it. Then again, for the license to drive it. You're taxed for the gas that you put in it to drive on the roads. Then you're taxed with tolls to pay for those roads, and again with meters to park along one. Want to get married? Marriage tax. Honeymoon? Hotel tax. Want a divorce? Court tax. Buy a dog, catch a fish, have a drink. Taxed, taxed, taxed. Come to think of it, even in death, it's going to cost you some Benjamins. From beginning to end, life is expensive, and that's especially true with housing. The massive spike in home values means a tougher market for buyers and higher taxes for owners. In some cases, these increased tax bills are just beyond what homeowners are prepared to pay. In Johnston County, for instance, they just did a countywide reevaluation of homes, and the increase there was pretty dramatic. On average, homes jumped 70% in value. In some areas, they more than doubled. Now, tonight, we're going to talk about what that means for property taxes, how they come up with that number in the first place, how you can fight it, and the ways you can benefit, even if you don't plan to sell your home. Let's start by explaining how property taxes work. I know, stick with me. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's important here. Let's say, as an easy example, that the county is made up of these 3 homes, all with different values. Now, these homes need schools and police and fire trucks and potholes fixed and that sort of thing. That's the cost of services. Let's say that cost is $1,500. Now, the county adds up the value of the homes, then divides that number by the cost of services, and that gives you the tax rate. They then apply that rate to each home individually. So that means if the value of some homes go up a lot more than others, some people will see their taxes go up more than others. And some people might not notice much of a difference at all. All right, now obviously it is not that simple, but it really means that just because the value of your home went up, it doesn't mean that your taxes are going to follow to a T. I discussed this with 2 local professors, Christopher McLaughlin from UNC and Roby Sawyers from NC State. They explain this much better than I do.
The fact that the value is higher doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to pay more property tax, right?
Just because the tax value of your home has gone up by 30 or 40% does not mean your tax bill is going to go up by 30 or 40%, because it depends on the rate being adopted each year by your community, by your county.
And it's true. Take Wake County, for example. Last year, their countywide assessment showed a 50% increase on average for home values there, but the tax rate came down about 22%. So home values up, tax rates came down. But that's not always the case everywhere. So who decides what that rate is going to be? Well, your county commissioners.
So we have elections every 2 years. And if you, as a resident of a particular community, aren't thrilled with the financing, the budgeting, and the taxation decisions being made by your local elected leaders, you have a chance to change that board, right? And make your voice be heard.
But that's why it's important to pay attention to who your county folks are that you're putting into office and are setting the budgets, and pay attention when you have whatever it may be, borrowing from the county to pay for special parks and things like that as well.
Okay, this isn't meant to be mean. I'm not picking a fight, but real quick, can you name your county commissioners? Can you name one county commissioner? I get it. Life is busy. You probably can't. In Wake County, these are the people here. If you live somewhere else, look it up. It's really easy to find. So now that you know who we're talking about, what should you be paying attention to? How will you know if the numbers that these people come up with are fair?
A really important question to ask is, what was the revenue neutral tax rate after this reappraisal? And that's a slightly complicated topic, but basically it's a way to say, okay, county, your tax base increased, right? It's a bigger tax base now. What tax rate would you county have to adopt to keep the revenues neutral from last year, meaning keep the countywide tax bill the same? And that is a number that needs to be published by every county, by every town, after a reappraisal, after we get a new tax base amount. And what you as a taxpayer want to do is say, okay, here's the revenue neutral tax rate that you published and told us about. What rate did you actually adopt? Did you adopt a rate higher or lower than that? Because that's really going to tell you as a taxpayer, as a voter, whether or not the local elected leaders kept the cap on expenses, kept the cap on revenues, or took advantage of that reappraisal to raise the tax bill for the entire county.
All right, that makes sense, right? Now, you said that the counties need to publish those numbers. That doesn't mean that they actually do or make them easy to find. I mean, we looked around everywhere and we couldn't find them. But I will almost guarantee you that costs have gone up. I mean, you know the way how everything in your life is getting more expensive? That's true for the county as well.
We as individual consumers have unfortunately had the inflation affect us all. And the things we buy at the grocery store, if we run a business, and the things we buy for our business, and the employees that we hire for our business, that's what the government has to do as well. Right, so the government faces these cost increases that we've seen more recently with inflation, just like we have as individuals. Doesn't make it any easier for us, but you do have to understand that they do face the same pressures as we do. I mean, it is certain when you get a valuation that you should expect some amount of increase in the property tax that you pay.
But who will see the biggest increases, the type of increase that people are worried about? It's actually quite simple. See, it comes down to the houses that went up the most. Now, everyone saw some type of increase, right? But if the value of your home went up a lot more than the others, well, you're going to see your taxes go up a lot more than others. So if you are in one of those neighborhoods where values are doubling, there will be a price to pay, and there will be people who struggle to pay it.
This is where I kind of want to retire to, too, also in my home. So now what I have to do, if I can't afford it, where do I go? Where do I live? Who's going to pack up all my stuff and move it? You know, that's a big change in this time of life.
We heard from people in Johnston County, longtime residents, people on fixed incomes, people afraid of being unable to afford to stay in the home they already own because of taxes.
Some folks may say, well, gee, just sell. Your land's so expensive. But I'm attached to this land. And like I said, my children have grown up here. This is the only place they've ever known.
It's similar to gentrification. Now, I've covered gentrification in every major city I've ever lived. It's where people start moving into low-income neighborhoods for low cost, but they have extra money, so they do major renovations or build big brand-new homes. And pretty soon, housing prices go up. Rents start to follow. Next thing you know, there's a Whole Foods moving in, and long-time residents get priced out. When this happens in a city, people typically step up and do something about it. It's happening in Raleigh right now and was met with a $1.5 million fund to help counteract gentrification and show some respect to the families that built the foundation. But with taxes, we don't call it gentrification. We call it the way it is.
What counties can do in response to that is very limited because the state legislature, the General Assembly, sets the property tax rules statewide. Local governments do not get to choose or create their own property tax exemptions or property tax relief systems.
So what are these exemptions? Well, they only get this little section here of the Wake County brochure. You have to be 65 and up on a low income, which is about $37,900, 100% disabled and on a low income, or a veteran with a total and permanent disability, or the unmarried surviving spouse of one. And that's it.
Residents can suffer when especially when they're long-term fixed income residents, seeing the values of their properties go up along with their tax bills.
This is part of living in a state that's growing like ours is growing. And I'll tell you, no one is going to swoop in and save you from it. I know that can be intimidating for some people, but it's up to you to find solutions. It's up to you to reach out and do something about it. You could write your state lawmaker and then wait. You could try and vote somebody in who's going to change things, do them the way you think they should be done, and wait. Or you could do something right now, starting with that valuation. Coming up, we're going to tell you the ways to challenge that and even benefit from it.
I really encourage folks to reach out to their local tax offices. Remember, these are neighbors. These are people living in the same communities as you, working hard, doing their best to make sure they're protecting the county's finances, the town's finances, but also protecting taxpayers as well, making sure taxpayers are being treated fairly. These are not just big bad folks trying to grab as much money as they can. They're our neighbors, right? Working in these local governments. They ain't getting rich doing that. They're trying to contribute back to the community. So I encourage taxpayers to feel comfortable to reach out, whether it's by phone, email, or go visit the tax office and say, here's the situation. Can I help? Can I better understand how you got to this tax value and better understand what programs might be out there to help me pay these bills?
Look, no one likes taxes. And of all the ways we're taxed, property tax is a unique one. I mean, think about it. Taxing your property value is taxing an unrealized gain. Do you remember this from the election? Kamala Harris wanted to raise taxes on billionaires by taxing the growth of their stock portfolio. So, for example, maybe someone invested $1 million in Apple back in the day, and over the years, that $1 million grew into $10 million. Well, that profit, that $9 million profit, sits in the stock market as an asset, a lot like the increased equity sits in your home. But the government doesn't tax that increase in stocks, not until you actually sell the stock. But that's not the case with your home. That increased value, that unrealized money gets taxed each and every year just sitting there.
It is a tax on an asset without question. Now, whether that is, and it's not on taxation, only occurs when the property sells. There's no right theory of taxation, right? There's competing different theories of taxation. And I really come back to the basic question of how can local governments pay for these services?
As we mentioned, there are a lot of different taxes out there. Some of the big ones, property tax, sales tax, income tax, and they vary from state to state, how they use them and how much they actually take. Florida and Oregon, for example, they actually have the same average property tax, and it's higher than what we pay here in North Carolina. But consider this. Oregon has no sales tax. Ours is 4.75%. Florida has no income tax. We do. Ours actually just went down a little bit to 4.25%. Now, maybe you have heard a little criticism out there that lowering the income tax will increase property taxes over time because local governments will have to make up the difference. But our local professors said that's not really how North Carolina is set up.
Certainly, as our state individual income taxes have gone down, the rates have gone down over several, really last decade or so, more pressure on the state government's resources and finances. And I think it's logical to assume that there'll be less support at the local level for things that the state may have paid for in the past. So, yeah, I don't know if we can tie that directly to reductions in state individual income tax, for example, but I think it's a logical extension of that reduction in state taxes.
But I don't believe that we can draw a direct line between decreasing state income taxes and increasing local property taxes, because those income taxes are really not directly tied to local government revenues in any substantial form.
Okay, so if income tax going down isn't raising your property taxes, then what is? Let's vent for a bit, shall we? I think we deserve it. Probably make us feel better. So first of all, why is your home value way up in the first place? Is it because you're killing it? Because you're printing money? Maybe. Congrats if that's the case. But in reality, this explosion we've seen in home values isn't directly tied to prosperity. The pandemic shut down the world in 2020, but interest rates were at record lows, and they stayed that way to keep the housing market humming along. By 2021, they dipped down to 2.65% on a 30-year mortgage. You can see it right there, that little bar there on the right. At the same time, people wanted out of big cities. 2 million people fled New York and LA and Chicago and the like from 2020 to 2022. And North Carolina was the perfect place to relocate. In fact, the Triangle was among the 10 fastest growing areas in the U.S. during that time, especially our suburbs. The growth was unprecedented. We'd never seen anything like it. It was cheaper here. So when people sold their $2 million homes up in New York, they could get something bigger here for less than half the price. They came with money and were willing to spend. Homes went into bidding wars and prices started to climb. Now, at the same time, the government started pumping trillions of dollars of COVID aid into the economy. You compare that with the supply chain chaos we were seeing, and the world then entered that age of inflation. Here's a story from the summer of 2021. Rising cost of steel, lumber, and copper is hampering home building and pushing home prices out of reach. You see, new homes still aren't being built fast enough, and the ones that are too expensive. First-time home buyers are being priced out, and the people who own their homes aren't moving. And why would they? People who bought when rates were in the 2s and 3s, they don't want to lose those rates. It's why so many Americans feel trapped in some ways in their homes by their low-rate mortgages. It's what's known as golden handcuffs. There's also remote work. Now, traditionally, one of the biggest reasons someone moves, especially when they're younger, is for work. But you don't have to do that anymore, at least not as much. And wouldn't you know it, we rank on that list as well. The Raleigh-Cary metro area ranks number 2 nationwide for remote work, and Durham-Chapel Hill is in the top 10. That's why the home you bought in 1995 for $200,000 is now worth $600,000. Not because our piggy banks are overflowing. In fact, most people couldn't even afford the home they live in right now if they were forced to buy it again today. It has been out of our control. So let's look at ways to get a little bit of that back.
Like, if you're going to fight your taxes, you got to have some data behind you. You can't just say, I think my house is too high. You get an appraisal, and the most recent comp, and hopefully that value will be different from what they come up with.
Appeals, appraisals, borrowing on your home, slashing your mortgage insurance. That part of the story right after the break. Okay, here we are. The show is almost over. Many of you are thinking, okay, well, this has been great. Money is tight. Everything, including my taxes, are going up, and there doesn't seem to be anything I can do about it. And I will say, your hands are pretty much tied when it comes to the increased costs of groceries and electricity and insurance rates and childcare and Netflix and everything else that is getting more noticeably more expensive in our everyday lives. But I do have some options for you on this tax stuff, starting all the way back at the beginning with your valuation, because you can appeal, and oftentimes it works. 60% of people who filed an appeal with Wake County last year saw a tax savings. They saved some money. That said, a really small percentage of people actually appealed. Of the more than 400,000 properties in Wake County, less than 10% tried. So, if all 400,000 people appealed, would the success rate still be at 60%? Probably not. But it is fair to say there are a lot of people out there leaving money on the table because they don't want to take the time to do this. And it makes sense that the county might not get it right the first time. After all, it's not a perfect system. They aren't going door to door. I spoke to the owner of Triangle Appraisal Group about how this process works.
An individual appraisal of one home, it's, one person you make the appointment, one person's going there. It's a little bit more intimate. With the mass appraisals, for tax purposes, they're taking data from public records, multiple listing service, the trends going on. For the most part, they do a pretty good job. We do get a lot of calls, and a lot of times we can't help the people. To be honest, we just say, hey, listen, that looks like the value within the range, an acceptable range of value.
So how do you make it work for you? Well, appealing your property value will require some homework. First, you look at the property values in your area. Look at the recent home sales in your neighborhood and compare the county's assessment to the reality of your home. For instance, the county might count your attic as a part of your square footage, but if your attic isn't finished, if it's not a living space, well, you got a case there, but you have to prove it. And it all starts with picking up the phone and calling the tax office. And I get it, that can be intimidating and time consuming, but in the end, it could be worth it.
If you do go there, you have to go with proof, because they're going to have their own proof of why they feel like that the house is valued at this level. If they have the wrong data, it could easily be the wrong value.
Be proactive and reach out to their county tax office, who are going to be responsive and work with taxpayers to make sure they're eligible for applying for and receiving whatever tax relief programs might be available to them.
Now, whether you win or lose that appeal, there are some other ways that you can benefit from having a higher home value without putting it on the market, without selling your house. You could, for instance, take out a home equity loan. The bank lends you money using the equity in your home as collateral, meaning you'll get a pretty good rate on that loan.
Increased property values means you have more equity in that home. Even if you have a mortgage on it, you now have additional value in there that you could borrow against, right? I know many people don't particularly want to sell their homes today. They don't want to cash in on that increased value, but you might be able to withdraw some money, some additional equity from that property if you need help with bills.
There's also another one that people often overlook. You can also eliminate your mortgage insurance. Your bank calls this PMI, and this is something that first-time home buyers are very familiar with. So basically, mortgage insurance is this extra bill that you pay if you couldn't put that full 20% down when you bought your home. And you pay that insurance every month until you have at least 20% equity in the house, which means if your home value skyrockets, your equity increases, and that increase can help you cross that 20% mark overnight. And once that happens, you can dump those extra insurance payments. So give your lender a call and ask them about this. I had a buddy who did this, and the insurance company actually said that he was pre-approved based on the new numbers. Mortgage insurance eliminated. It was gone. One less bill to pay at the end of the month. But he called them. All right, they're not going to call you and tell you about this savings you can have. The benefits of having a higher home value really all depend on you. Then again, you could just sell, but guess who's going to get a piece of that profit?
Downsizing is difficult. Finding someplace that is of equal value to you as a resident, it can be difficult to do. And of course, you may have income tax consequences when you sell the property as well.
So if you have something to say about tonight's discussion, please email us your comments, questions, or your criticisms on the record at WRAL.com. You can also email me directly at dan@WRAL.com. This is the kind of stuff that we talk about all the time on WRAL News at 7 o'clock, especially during my segment In Depth with Dan Haggerty. Let's talk about taxes, how much it costs to just get by these days, and pretty much anything else that you'd like to see on the local news. Tell me what's on your mind, and we'll go in depth. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of On the Record. Have a great night.